Um, all right. So since it is sort of a small crowd, I think it can be more participatory. But Robin and I will start with an intro. Um, Rob, how about you kick us off? And there's some more folks in the waiting room. Why don't you kick us off and explain what exactly cultural drift is and why we should fear it?
Hello, everyone. I'm Robin Hanson, economics professor at George Mason. I'm 65 years old. I've been a polymath and trying lots of different subjects over the years. So I've only recently come to culture within the last year as a topic. And I have to admit, I've neglected it. And so I understand why other people would neglect it too. And so I feel like I'm struggling to figure out how to make it clear it's actually important and fundamental when it's the sort of thing that I, until recently, also thought was fluffy, ill-defined, unimportant, because we have this stereotype of culture that it's about, foods and dress and songs and, various sorts of fun things to do, but it doesn't really matter. And it's not even well defined. It's just sort of a name to give to a bunch of fluffy stuff. And in fact, cultural evolution is humanity's superpower. This is the thing that makes humans different from other animals. And, once upon a time, evolution invented sex, which allowed animals to inherit stuff from two parents instead of one. And culture allows us to inherit stuff from many other parents. And that allows us to invent and improve far faster than other animals. It's really powerful and really important. But the key thing is its fundamental engine is just natural selection. It just works on humanity trying different cultural elements and then some of them succeeding more than others. That's the key process for pretty much everything. But of course, here we are, we're rich and we're powerful, so you'd think, looks like we're going great. Cultural evolution has made us spectacularly successful and powerful, right? Well, there's two levels of evolution, and one of them is going especially great, but kind of at the expense of the other. And so that's my struggle, is to get you see the two levels and to see how much trouble we are in at this other level that we're neglecting. So think of the analogy of species in just ordinary biological evolution, evolving DNA instead of culture. With species, there is evolution within species, and then there's evolution of or between species. And the bigger a species is, the more members it has, the faster and more powerful can be the evolution within the species, because any new innovation can spread to the entire species and there's more places for the innovations to start. But there's also features of species that don't change within the species. And for innovation of those things, you just need more little species so that different things can be tried. And in classic biological evolution, there's this trade-off. You either get evolution of species better by having more smaller species, or you get evolution within the species better by having fewer big species. And it turns out that if we look back in terms of where most innovation came from to the species of today, places that had more fragmentation, like coral reefs, rainforests, or rivers, they actually produce more innovation. And more of the species we have now came from those fragmented places with lots of little species. So evolution of species actually mattered more than evolution within species. And a similar thing is true for corporations. Corporations have cultures, and those cultures can be good or bad. And you can evolve things within a corporation, like big corporations. If they have an innovation anywhere inside, it can spread to the whole company. So evolution of things that can vary within a corporation, that works better when you have fewer bigger corporations. But to evolve the features that are distinctive of a corporation that can't vary very much within it, to have evolution of those things, you need more smaller corporations. And in fact, overall, innovation happens faster in the economy when there are more smaller firms than fewer bigger ones. So again, evolution of beats evolution in. Okay, that's that all sounds abstract, but what does that have to do with us? Well, we are in macro cultures, and once, like centuries ago, the world was full of basically hundreds of thousands of little peasant cultures, each of which had maybe 1,000 or so people in it. And there was enormous evolution of cultures back then because there were so many different cultures, and they were pretty close to the average survival. That is, they were poor, and so pandemics, famines, wars could knock them out. There was strong selection pressure, enormous variety, and strong evolution of cultures. But because they were also fragmented, evolution within cultures was slow and innovation was slow. And then in the last few centuries, we crushed small peasant cultures into a few national cultures, then we crushed national cultures into a global monoculture, and we've greatly reduced selection pressures, i.e., far fewer famines and pandemics and wars kill off any of these cultures. And so we have much less variety, much less selection pressure. And the rate of change of these cultures internally, just the ways they change themselves, is much higher. And so because we just have a few macro cultures, we have wonderful, fantastic evolution within this culture in terms of innovating technology and even better corporate cultures. But there's this other layer, the one that mattered more, is the evolution of the features that cultures share. And we have much less evolution of that and much less evolutionary pressure of that. And that's then the thing that we can risk going wrong. That the features of cultures that we share, our key norms, our key status markers, things like that, those plausibly would then just go wrong. That is, they would change through internal processes that weren't connected to selection pressures, and those would therefore just be random with respect to selection pressures, and therefore just become maladaptive. And that wouldn't be disciplined by selection pressures because they're very weak, and they would move very far, very fast because of these high internal drift processes. And there wouldn't be very many of them because we just have this one macro culture. And so we would just see our culture go wrong. So that sounds very abstract and hypothetical. But I think the clearest concrete example that shows it is fertility. We have this very surprising fact to a biologist that we have this very successful species with very good times and plenty of resources, and yet its fertility is declining and mostly below replacement and continuing to fall, even though it's below replacement. And the main proximate causes of that, if you say, why is that happening, are a number of cultural trends that seem kind of random or seem hard to understand why they would be this way versus some other way. And we can have maybe a more fundamental theory of them, but it's still whatever's causing these things, they are big changes and they're having huge consequence to fertility, which is quite plausibly straightforwardly maladaptive from a biological point of view. And that's plausibly because of this cultural drift process. So here's, so this should be surprising. That is, most people, it's really even hard to see culture. It's hard to see the norms that we have and share and the status markers, and to see that those could be different because the ones of our culture just seem obviously right if you don't think about it. And it's hard to see that those things could be wrong, and you're just built to trust them. That is, you all kind of know abstractly that other cultures have other values and other norms and other status markers, but you just assume that your cultures are right. You don't think about that much. And you don't think about the idea that your culture could have just given you mistaken versions of those that are just broken and getting broken. That's just really hard to even believe or conceive that this thing we all really trust intuitively and we hold dear, really, which is the precious things of our culture that we share with each other that we most believe in, that those things themselves could be going wrong, is just really hard to accept. And then it's really hard to figure out what the hell we could do about it if we were to come to believe this. And we can go through some possible fixes, but honestly, none of them look very good. It actually seems really hard to fix this. But anyway, that's my quick
I'm
summary.
gonna
Go
I'm
ahead.
gonna jump in and ask, um, is this an idea that you that you came up with, or is it inspired by other texts that you've read?
Well, I mean, first I was looking at fertility as a problem, say a year and a half ago. And then I studied that for like 8 months, and I came to see that most people in the field of fertility do think the main cause is these cultural trends. So,
Okay.
and then that's outside of their field. And then I go talk to the culture people, and I learned about cultural evolution, and I say the cultural evolution. So, for, basically, I say, well, what do you think is going to happen with this fertility, and how is it going to play out? And I say, for example, like there are these rare, like Amish or Haredim, who are deviant cultures that are insular from the rest, and they have very high fertility. Are they just going to take over? And honestly, the main, most prestigious cultural evolution experts in our world said, yeah, duh, of course. That's just how it's going to play
Interesting.
out. And so you go, wait, what? But doesn't that mean our culture is, maladaptive, dysfunctional? If that's how it's going to play out, we're just going to get replaced by them. And they said, well, sure, but that's how it works, obviously. But they're not really interested in thinking of this as a problem we should think about fixing. They're just thinking abstractly about how culture works. But so they aren't saying, oh, this is a problem we should think about and worry about. I'm the one who's saying that, but they don't disagree with me, it seems, about the process that's going on. They just don't care.
Okay, so before I start asking more questions, since it's a small group, I'm going to open it up. And does anyone else have a question or something they'd like to like that they want to jump in and say before I carry on? Or and you don't need to raise your hand or anything; you can just jump in.
Please do. Yes,
I think we have some takers to the offer.
Um, I have a
please.
few questions. So Robin, could you define what a culture is? Or at least maybe point to some different kinds of analyses that have been offered in the literature. So you might think that it's something like shared norms, shared values. So then maybe the using the acronym of WEIRD, you might think that, most Western educated, um, industrialized nations constitute a culture. You might think it's more fine-grained than that, that it's, America has a specific culture that's not shared with the United Kingdom. And then you might think that within America, there are all sorts of subcultures. I mean, of course, there are,
Sure.
like the Amish being one. So could you just speak to what a culture is?
So the word culture gets used by different groups in different ways. Um, there is this prestigious but very small field of cultural evolution where people specialize in analyzing cultural evolution with mathematical models as a biological process. And for them, the word culture just means all behavior. That's any behavior that you could have learned from somebody else counts as culture for them. So their concept of the idea of culture is just everything. So that's not the idea of a culture. That's the idea of culture. That's at one extreme. At another extreme, there's like the culture section of the newspaper where they talk about museums and literature and fine art, etc. And they call that culture. Obviously, that's a much more narrow range of stuff than at the other extreme of people talking about things. But there's this third language of people talking about visiting a culture, learning a culture, assimilating a culture, maybe comparing cultures. And then that tends to point to groups of people who share a bunch of noticeable things without that much of a definition of which things they need to share. If I say I love Spanish culture, you don't ask me for a definition exactly of, well, what counts as a Spaniard in Spanish culture, right? We just notice, well, if you go to Spain, there's a whole bunch of things that are similar together and you call it that. Or if you say, Amazon has a culture, then it's the unit of Amazon carrying that. But more truthfully, the fundamental thing to point to is just that among the things we can learn from each other, some of them are things that we're just able to vary individually so that we'll have healthy cultural evolution because we can just try it differently, like how you open a door or how you screw off a jar, right? If somebody, or even how you open a banana, right? most people learn to open a banana a certain way, but apparently there's a better way. And you could read it up online and learn to open the banana the better way, but nobody's going to punish you for opening banana the wrong way. So this new banana opening innovation can spread easily. That counts as culture, but it's not the features of a culture. And so I would say when I talk about these two levels, the level that is problematic is the level of things that are hard to vary individually, like status markers, for example. When we all decide education is counts a lot for status, that's hard for an individual to vary. I can just not go to school, but I will still be dinged by other people for not going to school in my status. And I can't just ignore and defy all the other people judging each other based on the status marker. Similarly for norms, if say we have an anti-racism norm, then it'll be hard to be racist openly because there'll be a lot of shaming of violating that norm. So the things I'm trying to call attention to are the things that are hard to vary individually, because those are the things that, in order to have healthy cultural evolution of, you will need to have evolution of different groups doing it different ways. And yes, basically, there's kind of a fractal structure, or even worse, in terms of some norms are shared widely, some norms are shared more smallly. Sometimes a family will have a norm, and then you need to follow that norm in the family, but not in another family. Corporations have cultures, and then they have norms, and the Amazon culture has a norm about how they do meetings, but that doesn't apply in Microsoft.
So Robin, is your contention that culture is stagnating, or that it's the norms are becoming like increasingly more maladaptive?
Well, it's the macro norm. So if you think about the norms of Amazon or Microsoft or that sort of thing, those norms are shared within a company, but then, and maybe even affiliated companies will share them if they go to the same meetings, but then they can be quite different in another company. And so I'm much less worried about those, because there'll be sufficient variation in the world in those and selection so that the bad ones will go away. And so then the question is, well, what kind of norms do we not have sufficient variation and selection for? And then I may say, look at the norms that are contributing to fertility decline. Those are much more widely shared norms. And they do seem to be correlated strongly across the whole world. So you might have thought, look at the world, go visit the world. It's clearly quite varied. There's lots of different cultural variation in the world. But if you look a little more closely, the world has a lot less cultural variation, you might think, especially among elites. And we could go through examples of that, if you want to press it. But basically, the place I came to this was noticing fertility decline is happening because of a half dozen cultural trends that are pretty worldwide. And strong enough that most of the world is now below replacement fertility and continuing to decline. And those trends so as an example, think about COVID. When COVID first showed up, at the very beginning, the usual public health experts said the usual things about masks didn't matter that much and travel restrictions wouldn't help. And then within a month, world elites all talked about the subject and came up with a new set of conclusions about what to do. And then the entire world did it that way. And there is really remarkable convergence in many areas of regulation, including medical ethics and airlines and nuclear power and electricity and all sorts of things. And so, and in fact, if I speak to elites around the world and meet them, each elite tells me the following two things. They tell me that the people where they come from have some unique features the world should value. And they tell me that they personally have no unique distinguishing features and they would work just fine in any international organization. That is, elites really are part of a world monoculture today. And, many areas of policies are really quite convergent worldwide. We have 100 nations in the world, but we don't really have 100 independent policy experiments at all. On most policies, most of the world does it the same way.
Raj, I don't want to pick on you, but it seems like you maybe have something to say.
Yeah, no, thanks, Catherine and Robin, for hosting this. I just had a couple of thoughts to spark up as you were talking, Robin. It seems like there's a confluence of factors. Like the thing that comes to mind is like the historical cycles. So given the rise and fall of empires, it's kind of become its own like subcultural, you know, I guess lens, so to speak. So what are your thoughts on sort of the rise and fall of, on the macroeconomic side, various empires, and then the cultures they, kind of distribute across the world under their empire? And then the other thing is like, because of technology, we live in basically a quasi post-scarcity society where we have a too much freedom sometimes, and we have too many options and too much abundance, and kind of leads to some of these issues, which is like, in the middle class, most of the middle class can't afford to have kids. There's a lower class that are having the kids, like lower income, for example, and then there's super elite, wealthy folks that are able to afford having kids. So there's like a U-shaped curve in almost in terms of the distribution right now. So like, I guess, what are your thoughts on these confluences that are happening?
So you raised several different points. One, what about empires in the past? And then what about us getting rich, or comfortable now? And then what about, middle class not being able to afford kids? Those are three sort of separate topics.
Yeah.
First, I might say, if we ask what is the fundamental cause of the rise and fall of empires, it could well be that cultural drift is a common fundamental cause of the decline of empires. That is, an empire gets an entire empire-wide culture, and then that culture drifts during its heyday when it's safe and secure, and then that drift causes decline. And, the Roman Empire is obviously a striking example, because not only did it decline, it seems to have declined in substantial part due to falling population, due to falling fertility,
Yeah.
which seems to have had many of the similar causes to our falling fertility. So that's a suggestive example that maybe more generally empire decline is due to falling fertility. But at least in a world where there are multiple empires, you believe that one empire that allows its culture to decline and drift will be then displaced by other, neighboring areas that aren't empires or their empires. That's on the first point. The second point is the point I've been trying to say, is that the plausible cause of cultural drift would be the lack of selection pressures, which is caused by being so rich and comfortable that, everybody survives, everyone goes on, even if they change their culture a lot. So that is the absence of selection pressures on cultures. And selection pressure is the engine that has made humanity have powerful culture. And then on the third point, middle-class people today are vastly richer than people in the past who had a lot more kids. So it just can't be only wealth. That's the explanation for declining fertility. That's why most of us look at these key cultural trends as the key proximate causes of fertility decline. Again, I could go through those particular trends if you like.
Just had a follow-on question to that point. So now we have genetic engineering, we have gene therapy, like the biotechnology is basically, of course, it's merging with big data and AI, and now we're able to sift through data faster and faster. And so in the next couple of decades, even, like, we'll be able to have designer babies, so to speak. How, you can kind of do this polygenic scoring today. There's companies that do that. So from your vantage point in your research, like reconciling all the back-tested research, but when you look at the future, what do you see? Like, will technology solve some of these problems for us and make it just cheaper to have people? And will we have like bats, right? Like human, basically bats, and
So most of the cost of raising kids is after they're born,
right,
as any other parent here will know. So lowering the cost of the period of pregnancy, I don't think is going to make a major difference in parenting. There are some.
Can I interrupt?
Go ahead, please.
I mean, I think there's something there. I think one of the cultural norms that it has changed is women don't want to be pregnant, and it could either be necessity of being in the office, right? It's very difficult to even work an office job when you're pregnant, or they want to appear younger longer. There's any like number of reasons, right? So that might, right, that might have an impact, if not cost broadly.
Yes, but the next 20 years of parenting will also get in the way of their work and their looks. is not just the pregnancy that does that. So, I mean, honestly, if we just had huge industrial scale orphanages as a technology, that would work. But people hate that idea, that our culture is very much against that. Our culture is very much in favor of artisanal individual parenting. And that's an obstacle to a big tech fix. I mean, the tech fix there is not that recent a tech. You know, industrial scale orphanages have been around for a while and they can work, but people hate them. So again, it's a cultural obstacle. I can talk more about artificial intelligence and how that's actually a plausible solution, but you might not like it.
Is that the transhumanist, I guess, angle in terms of us merging and having?
No, the main thing is that a key feature of artificial intelligence and a related kind was brain emulation, which is the subject of my second book here, The Age of Them, is that it's possible to make robots in the factories faster than you can make human babies and raise them.
Mm-hmm.
And that means the population of AIs can just always grow faster than the economy.
That's right.
And that's the key condition for a Malthusian equilibrium, where the population rises, and as it rises, the wages fall until subsistence level. And at subsistence level, you do have strong selection pressures. So then a world full of AIs, the AIs themselves, if they had culture and could evolve their culture independently of us, then their culture would get fixed because they would be facing strong selection pressures. A lot of people really hate this vision. They hate this vision for anything we care about because they hate the idea of people at subsistence wages. And many people hate the idea that AI would be allowed to have an independent culture and make its own mind about what it values compared to us. They want to keep AI strongly controlled and make sure that it can't have values that diverge from ours. So you see, AIs, now there's a problem, which is that we have a deadline on the AI, which is when population falls due to fertility decline, innovations rates will also fall. And that means if you don't invent AI soon enough, then there would be several centuries of decline during which it wouldn't happen either. And you have to wait for AI to appear after a new civilization rises again, the Amish in some new form or whatever. But if we can invent human level AI before this deadline, which I estimate to be roughly 70 years worth of progress at the familiar rates, then AIs, if they were free to have their own culture, would be at a subsistence level. They would be Malthusian. They would face strong selection pressures and therefore plausibly end cultural drift for themselves, at least. But whether that would be for humans depends on how much humans share their culture.
Something I like a dumb question that I always have about the fertility conversation is like, why won't the population just become like, what's so bad with a smaller population is what I mean. Like, isn't it like returning to like 1930s levels or something like this? Like, is it because the number of older people will overload the system?
There are a number of small things wrong with it, but you might think those are worth the big thing benefits. So small things wrong are like the population gets older and it's harder to pay for retirement if you're taxing the younger people, pay for that. Older people are just less innovative as it is. When the population is smaller, there are fewer scale economies. You know, there'll be fewer flights going from different places. You have to wait longer for a flight, right? There'll be fewer specializations in restaurants and other products because the whole economy will be smaller. But honestly, those are all minor inconveniences compared to basically innovation grinding to a halt, i.e. you just have a long period with pretty much no new things. And that plausibly would take away the main pressure for liberal societies, liberal policies and polities. Innovation,
but how are we so sure that there'll be no new thing? I mean, like we've had new things up until this point, and the population's
so I'm just going to invoke my authority as an economist here to say economists have studied this. We're pretty sure I could walk through the mechanism for you, but we just basically think that yes, innovation will fall more than proportionally to population. If population goes down by a factor of 10, innovation rates will go down by more than a factor of 10, and it'll take 10 times as longer to get whatever you're hoping to get. But again, I'm leaving you the discretion to press, and if you want the details, I can walk through the economic theory of it.
I'm just sort of throwing out
But
like
we're kind of confident of that.
layman's
I mean,
questions.
it could be more I think it's a bit more speculative to say that, look, the thing that caused the world to become liberal was a few centuries ago, a few countries suddenly started getting rich, and primarily because they were very innovative. And the rest of the world says, we're going to be left behind if we don't catch up and copy whatever's making them win. That means we need to be a lot more open to innovation, which means we need to be a lot more liberal. If innovation grinds to a halt, they no longer need to be liberal to keep up. And many natural pressures will be to lock down and take control and no longer allow as much freedom and innovation as we have today. So that's a second reason, but I think the most fundamental reason is just that if you cared about the future and you wanted to influence it, then the future will be determined by, say, the Amish and the Haredim, who will take over the earth and make it their way and may throw away a lot of our stuff. So this might sound speculative, but basically this is what happened in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire declined in population to lower fertility, but the Christians maintained a steady rate of doubling every 20 years for 300 years. And that allowed them to go from being a few hundred people to taking over the Roman Empire. And then they threw away a bunch of stuff they didn't like about the Roman Empire, and a lot of stuff was just lost in the decline in scale. So if we want stuff we value about ourselves to last, then we want to figure out a way that we don't go away and get replaced.
But aren't we much better at solving problems than the Romans were? Like the one of the examples I was thinking of is, for say science, or like more specifically like physics. Physics is presumably like a monoculture in the world. But it seems to be really good at solving problems and making progress regardless, right? Like you said at the beginning, right? Having a bunch of different cultures and having a lot of sort of innovation within a culture are two ways of solving the problem, right? But if you get so good within the culture, like say physics, then maybe you don't need 3 kinds of physics or something like that. Does that make sense to you?
So think about an ancient person trying to figure out how to fish, right? You could just inherit in your DNA some fishing habit. Many animals do, but that's a very slow way to innovate. The simplest versions of culture would be to fish like the high prestige, whatever the most prestigious people are, however they fish, or fish like how most people fish. That's at least a way that you'd be doing better than average in copying people and fishing better. But the really great way to fish is to look around and say, who catches the most fish? And let's fish like them. So whenever culture has these very specific metrics and heuristics about what specific indicates success, then cultural evolution can just be much more powerful about that. And physics is full of that. You see, physics and mechanical engineering and a whole bunch of worlds near that have collected a bunch of powerful metrics for evaluating proposals and theories and ideas and designs that allow them to evaluate them without like having a whole civilization try them and see if the civilization succeeds or fails, right? The thing we have trouble in cultural evolution is, how do we know which are the better versions of things? And if the only way we know is that a culture rises or dies on the basis of embodying it, now it's going to be just much harder to figure out which of those versions are best.
But that's only if you're thinking of cultures as sort of like the level of selection, right? You can have a lot of other levels of selection within a culture for various ideas.
Well,
various
you could select,
subcultures.
like, for example, you could select the most newsworthy ideas. And then the question is, do you have a good metric of newsworthy? So, for example, one of the key mechanisms of cultural evolution is this idea that we just copy the prestigious. And that works if, in fact, the prestigious people do things better. But on many dimensions, they don't necessarily actually do things better, in which case we don't actually make the world better by copying the prestigious. So cultural evolution at the very beginning was this very crude thing. And over time, cultural evolution has learned many specific ways to make cultural evolution better. This is the key way humans have gotten better. Cultural evolution has bootstrapped by basically inventing more specific metrics by which you can judge what's good or bad. And then you can do a lot more local variation and testing against this metric, which is a lot cheaper than having a whole civilization rise or fall. That's how we've done it in physics. We do that in many areas of engineering and sports, right? Like, how do you know if you have a good sport team if it wins? and you can run games over and over again, and you can try things, and you can learn quickly how to have a sport team that wins without having your whole civilization rise and fall many times trying out different sport things. But if you say, what about norms of parenting, say, how do we know if we have good parenting norms? Well, the question is, what metric will you evaluate those against? So, for example, there's this problem that many of our prestige metrics create a problem when the parents try to pass on their prestige to the children. The fewer children they have, the more prestigious they will be. Certainly happens for passing on wealth to children, but it can happen for other ways of investing parent effort into children. And that means that if we're all trying to copy the most prestigious people, we'll end up copying their behavior of having fewer kids. And that's a way in which this heuristic of copying the prestigious goes wrong if our prestige metric is a little off.
But it's funny though, because I mean, this is sort of why I brought up the science example, right? Because like our way of thinking about science used to be kind of what you're saying, right? Copying whatever the leader of the culture or whatever the society said, we just all went along with it, right? And then huge progress started to happen when we just stopped following whatever the authority was and started trying to understand it and get better, right? And you could do the same thing with all the these cultural effects too.
So with science, we had the two key heuristics of quality. One was consistency. So mathematics was all built on the concept of a consistent mathematical model, and they can be criticized for mathematical inconsistency. And the other was like empirical matching. You wanted to have mathematical models that matched empirical data. So once we agreed on those metrics, we could go wild developing science, and we didn't have to have the whole, this whole civilization try again. We could just each try to make a math model and see if it was consistent and see if it matched data. And we could just do that on a very fine level, even in our own lives, even in a few days. We could learn more about a subject by applying those metrics. So yes, a key thing that culture invents over time is ways to judge things, metrics for judging things that then let you not do all these expensive trials. And so we have collected many of those metrics. Like in business, capitalism works because business people have collected many local metrics for what works, largely say profit metrics. And then they can make a business and run it for a few years and see if they want to quit or not based on, are they making money? And that's a powerful way that people can keep searching in the space of different ways to run business without having to, again, reinvent the whole society. But for key cultural things like parenting norms or marriage norms, what metric are we supposed to use to judge whether those norms are good or bad?
Yeah, so both examples you gave of communities that had larger families were from faith-based communities. And so, my mind kind of goes to our last session on what is sacred. And, the first part of your theory there is more about the structure of that, not, what specifically is sacred, but
Right.
What are the components on how a culture or community interact to support a belief or whatever they've deemed sacred. So if you don't believe in family, and if you don't believe in supporting an extended family structure, I think it's harder to get people excited to support it with their resources. And thus the faith-based cultures are more likely to reproduce at higher rates, But do you see a tie-in with your what is sacred?
Definitely, once you realize the sacred is a thing and it's powerful and real, then you want to ask, well, okay, how is culture changing its attitudes toward the sacred, how it thinks of it, how it uses it, what it considers sacred? Those are key elements of culture. And now you think, could those be going wrong? Say we changed our mind about what was sacred. Well, how do we know if that's a good change? How would we decide that? The fundamental biological thing would be survival. Is our civilization, are your descendants going to survive and reproduce? But within our culture data, we don't think in those terms. So
well, and it's much more complicated, like you said in the last session. People don't just have one belief system.
right.
They have multiple ones, and they don't all exist in utopia together. They usually and often conflict. So the measurement is even more difficult because you're counterweighting all the different demands on those beliefs, right?
Right. But the way humans have traditionally solved this problem is they don't calculate all this stuff. The way we've just done it is you just inherit these cultural habits from your parents and your teachers and your TV heroes and wherever you get your culture. And then there's just a selection effect, i.e. the people who inherit good packages do better than the ones who don't. And that's been the mechanism so far through human history about how we have actually varied our culture. That's the way that we kept it healthy. But in the last few centuries, not only did we reduce this selection pressure, we created and celebrated a process of internal cultural change where honestly, the most prestigious people in our society for a while have been the people who see themselves and are seen as cultural activists, who see a way they want culture to change and then go out and push for it. And if they succeed, they are basically our highest heroes. But the standard they use to push for it isn't usually, well, look, let's calculate this is more adaptive, so we'll have more descendants this way. That's forbidden. That's actually really hated as a way to evaluate culture. What you're supposed to do and what people have been doing is saying, look, this way we could change culture. Doesn't it feel right? Isn't it meet your moral standards? And then whoever wins that gets to be the new leader of the new moral standards. So, and there's a lot of randomness in this. That is, the most culturally potent event of the 20th century was World War II. It was pretty random how it started, who was on whose side, who lost it, but still it had enormous cultural impact. We drew enormous lessons from World War II in terms of what we saw as culturally valuable or not, enormous norms.
Something we discussed one-on-one that I thought was really interesting is why subcultures aren't a good fix for the macro culture and macro norms homogenizing. I feel like there's tons of subcultures. We in particular discussed rationalism as one example, but they really don't provide the diversity that you would imagine they would.
Right. So I think most individuals aren't very comfortable with just being a generic member of the world macroculture. That's not very meaningful to them. Unless you're a high elite where you get a lot of meaning from being one of the few select elites in the world who is part of the elite macroculture and high in it, that gives a lot of meaning. But for most everybody else, they want some other stronger cultural identity than merely being part of the world elite macroculture. And so they often gravitate to fandoms, hobbies, all sorts of things that give them an identity that makes them feel part of a smaller group and more strongly attached to it. But most of these smaller cultures, like fandoms, they don't affect that wide a range of the behaviors of the people involved. That is, if you think of, say, Star Trek fans and Star Wars fans, they can disagree about what movies are best, and maybe that'll go over to other kinds of science fiction movies, but they will still parent the same and go to work the same and go to war the same. And honestly, the rest of their lives are pretty much the same. So the problem is, in order to have healthy cultural evolution, we need people whose culture, says a lot about a lot of their lives and says it differently. Like, say, the Amish or Haredim, those cultures, if you're in those cultures, you do a lot of things different. And that's the kind of thing level of variety we would need to have cultural selection be strong. But most people like the idea of shallow multiculturalism. They like the idea that there's many different foods and holidays and dresses and climates and things like that. But I did some surveys where I asked about 12 different kinds of variety in the world in which you want more or less of least. And the kind they wanted least of was more fundamental value differences. People hate the idea of people around the world varying in fundamental values, say gender equality or, all sorts of things like that. But those things are things that people really feel strongly they do not want variety on. But those are the key things that are driving, say, fertility decline and making us be a homogeneous monoculture.
Something that just came to mind as you were, describing, like, Star Trek and Star Wars fans don't have much differences with one another when it comes to how they like practically lead their lives. Fandom itself as an organizing structure causes a lot of cultural differences, as opposed to days when religion may have been more important than your fandom. I think for a lot of people, fandom is one of the most important components of their identity. And that's an interesting shift. I don't know if that's too,
right, but
it's
I
very
mean,
fertile.
does it change their behavior? Like, do fandom people parent different? Do they go to school different? Do they treat their neighbors different? Do they
As like as a structure, right? So all fandoms, right? So not comparing like K-pop stans versus Swiftie, but like as one group. I wonder if they do. I mean, I don't have an answer to that, but I wonder if shifting the locus of importance to a media property or a text, again, very liberally defined,
right?
if that actually causes some of these behavioral changes and
I
cultural
mean,
changes.
look, in some sense, almost everybody in modern society is a fan. That is, it's kind of a norm in society that we are all fans of some things. That is, somebody, if you say, you know, what's your favorite TV show or music or something, somebody says, I don't have a favorite. They just look kind of weird and, you know, out of touch and not very impressive. That is, we expect most people we meet to have some particular things they're fans of. That's just how we expect most people to
well,
be.
the point I'm trying to make is that's actually like, if you really think about what it means to be part of a fandom, it's actually a really big lifestyle change. Like more people are part of fandoms than they are actively religious. And there's like a consumer component to this. There's
Right.
It really is a very important part of people's identities. There's different slang associated. There's all sorts of things. And like, is fandom eclipsing, say, religion? I'm just saying that randomly,
Right.
maybe something
Right.
else.
But
Is that, you know, is that part of the problem? Is that part of the
definitely a thing we notice about religions is they feel free and they do speak to many aspects of your life behavior, right? They tell you how to marry, how to work, how to do charity, you know, how to die, how to go to war. That is, religions basically claim to and were accepted as getting to tell you a lot about all sorts of aspects of your lives. And then fandom seems to be much weaker than that. People do want some sort of identity and they are picking fandom, but it isn't providing that much variation in those other things.
Well, you know, people compare fandom to religion a lot, like in fan studies, right? Or even in sort of culture war articles about it. But what fandom lacks, I think, is transcendence. It provides a lot of rituals, but it doesn't have the transcendence of faith.
And that transcendence helps religion tell you what to do in more aspects of life. That is,
right.
in some sense, religion was the authority on the sacred until recently. And
I just wanted to kind of add what Katherine is saying. I think, yeah, to your point, Katherine, and your other point, Robin, about celebrities and heroes, so to speak. I mean, if tomorrow Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift have babies, like that's going to probably kick off. There's a hypothesis and a high chance probably that's going to kick off a lot of millennials also getting married and having kids as well. Because I see this, let's say, latent behavior of people having pets. They have cats, they have dogs, they have some pet, and then they treat these pets as children. And there's even a market around this. If you're like a VC, you put your VC hat on, you're like, okay, well, there's actually $1 billion business to be made, right? Just servicing this entire like pet care, so to speak. So I guess jumping off that point, like, do you think it's actually there's some optimism here to be had where some people have instinctually understood that they want to care for something, but they haven't internally through other cultural forces or maybe monetary forces or whatever, XYZ force, they haven't been able to make the next jump to becoming a parent and starting their journey towards becoming a parent, so to speak.
I think the key question at play here is just how much cultural variation and variety is enough. So clearly we don't have zero. But the reference point might be, say, think of 300 years ago when there were hundreds of thousands of peasant cultures in the world. That was enough. And now we're looking in between. Okay, what in between point could be enough? And I give you the reference point of, say, the Mormons. Mormons are rather distinct. They're noticeably distinct. You go visit them, you meet them. They have a lot of distinctive features. And a century ago, or a century and a half, they were really quite insular, and they had a lot of very different practices, including family practices, polygamy, etc. And then the Mormon Church Center made a conscious choice in the face of a lot of conflict with the rest of the United States to integrate more into US culture. And they, as the center, could direct that. And they did, in fact, integrate more into US culture. And now they are more integrated. And they do have a higher fertility, but it's falling at the same rate as the rest of the US, just 20 years behind. So they are not going to be anything like the Amish or Haredim. They are not going to succeed in having a different enough culture that can just sustain a whole different fertility because they are just insulated. The Mormons are then not different enough. And that's the level of, you need to be more different than the Mormons are here to be different enough to really have enough cultural variety to have really different behaviors. That should be scary in terms of a standard because the Mormons are pretty different. But that's not enough.
I want to make sure that everybody who wants to speak gets a chance to. So Joseph, Mark, I think you have mic problems if I'm remembering correctly. Andrew, Adam, does anyone want to say something who hasn't already or wants to add additional thoughts? As we are coming up, we have 4 minutes left.
Yeah, so I had a, oh, sorry.
I will be happy to stay after whatever deadline is, so just to be clear, but there will be a line when we will officially end.
So I was wondering about what the exact norms are that are so maladaptive. They seem to be associated with participating in the globalized economy. And at least several decades ago, so the South Korea, Japan, all of these countries that became westernized after World War II, their standards of they became extremely wealthy as a result. And then I don't know how long it took before fertility rates started dropping off, but it seems that the norms that are or the culture that's causing the problem was also at some point highly adaptive, such that people were trying to integrate themselves into the globalized economy in order to reap all of the benefits of it. So I was wondering when was there a transition from this culture being adaptive and conducive to social flourishing to it leading to decimating fertility rates?
So I was originally trying to call your attention to these two levels, like within species, within culture, between. The things you're noticing about getting rich are the within culture things. That is, by joining this large mass world culture, you get all the benefits of the scale economy and specialization of this world culture, and you get to be rich. But that comes at the expense of sharing key norms of the world culture, and then that will reveal itself with time as its consequences. So I think of this as more at that higher level, things have been just slowly going bad for a long time, but the consequences of that take a long time to be revealed. So if you think about the kinds of ways culture could be changing, I think we can classify it into sort of two categories. One would be just a random drift, where it's just started somewhere good and randomly walked away from there. And another way to think about it is that there were some tendencies we always had that selection was stopping and resisting and preventing. And I think those tendencies are better explains if there's a long-term consistent trend, it makes more sense to see it as that, as something that selection was resisting, but no, it stopped. So for example, I like this story where humanity was once foragers, and then that we all felt very natural as foragers, and foragers are what we were sort of built to be like. And then farming became possible, and it was only possible because we had enough cultural plasticity to create a bunch of new, very different cultural norms that said to farmers to act just very different. But in some sense, inside each farmer was a forager who wanted to be like a forager, but was persuaded to do otherwise through the strong cultural norms of the farming world. And poverty was a key part of the enforcement of that. And then as we started to get rich, we revealed that we wanted to go back to being more forager-like. And we found that we could, that is, we weren't getting punished anymore for doing so. And so that plausibly explains trends of democracy, leisure, art, travel, religion, fertility, a whole bunch of trends are all basically, we're gone back to be more forager-like compared to what the typical farmer culture was like. So then the story is,
Robin,
go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, forager like in what sense? Like, can you
Well,
give an
so
example of a
foragers were very
forager like
egalitarian.
behavior? Yeah.
Foragers were very egalitarian. They didn't work that many hours a day. They wandered around and didn't have that much stuff. They didn't have marriage. They were relatively promiscuous. And, basically farmers were different in the sense of having property and marriage and war and slavery, and worked a lot more hours of the day and had a lot more disease. And there's just a whole bunch of ways that farming life was different than the foraging life. And in most of those ways, we have gone back as we've gotten rich. And you could also think another sort, there's a standard complaint that basically when civilizations in the past got rich and then they were at peace, the elites got decadent. And you could think of decadence as also just a natural tendency of humans when times are good and there are few pressures. You might live life well and enjoy it without thinking that much about the future because you can. And that could be another way of thinking about a natural human tendency that in the past was disciplined. When individuals decided to get decadent for a while, that they suffered soon enough. And if even a local peasant culture just decided, well, let's not do crops this year, let's just party, they would suffer substantially very soon. And so it would be held in check. But in the last few centuries, as we get rich, these sorts of inclinations are less held in check.
Is cultural drift then just another term for decadence?
Well, decadence has so many associations, it's hard to know exactly what it means. It's obviously a disapproving term, but it's disapproving of what exactly isn't very clear. So cultural drift is more trying to have you think in terms of natural selection, i.e., look, there's these parameters that can bounce around, but selection in general would keep them in a healthy zone. That's how natural selection works. And if you take away those selection pressures, then it could just plausibly drift away from the adaptive zone. And whatever forces are making it drift away, you don't have much confidence those are adaptive forces. They might feel good or whatever, but they just wouldn't be adaptive. And that's the thing to realize. Our superpower is this culture, but our superpower was created by just random natural selection, not our being clever and thinking it through, not some divine plan. It was just random. And that means when the selection pressure goes away, it just goes bad.
Does anyone have anything else they would like to comment on, or any lingering questions? We are a little bit over the hour, so if you have to leave, feel free. We won't be offended. But happy to keep it open for a little bit longer if anyone has any.
Well, I was going to push back a little on the not enough cultural mix. I mean, if you live in a big city of 4 million or more, we're all very good at staying in our own lane, and we have our own little circles and we go to the same places. But if you went looking within 10 miles of where you live and actually looked for other types of people, especially with the influx of immigrants lately, I think there is quite a bit of cultural variety, both socioeconomic and international other cultures. But and I think it is the key. I don't know if it's enough for what Robin's looking for, but in my mind, it's definitely the key for solving so many social oriented issues, that interaction with people that have resources and people that don't, and interacting with them to shift some of those around. So I don't know what your measure is for diversity of culture within cities, but a lot of cities do have quite a span. Seems like just
Really illustrative to me as someone who is learning about this, in terms of examples that Robin has given it, are both the subcultures and fandoms. There's a lot of aesthetic differences, and I think they could be really meaningful. Like even not being able to afford certain things, but the actual practical way one leads their life isn't that different. Like I don't know, like I'm in some ways I'm very different from, let's say, like a like new Venezuelan immigrant in Chicago. But I don't know if the way I live my life is actually all that different. There are probably certain things, but I think we might be surprised by how similar we are with people who on an aesthetic level feel very, very different to us. And I'm open to having folks push back on that because I know it's a little bit provocative.
Well, the parameter I would call your attention to would just say be fertility, because that's our best tracking of cultural drift and decline. You might say all these different people you visit in the city, how different will their fertility be? And then I can give you, say, the 6 key cultural trends that are contributing to fertility decline. And I would say probably they aren't that different on these 6 key cultural trends that are causing them to share this low fertility. So in most big cities, it is low fertility. The fertility is lower in cities than in rural areas. And especially in rich parts of the world, all of those different people you will meet will have pretty low fertility. And so here, 6 of the 6 trends: gender equality, intensive parenting, long school preparation, marriage as capstone instead of cornerstone, parents having less involvement with grandkids in terms of raising them, urbanity, religion. These are some of the key trends. And my guess is most of the people you can meet in the city won't vary that much on very many of these key trends. That would be the claim. So
I would say, if a typical multi-generational American versus anyone who sends remittances overseas, I'd say those 2 families are very different. And I don't think you would just be able to become a part of that structure and have it flow. I think it would be jarring, because when you are releasing funds to a family,
sure,
I mean, that's just
right.
so different from how
but we have a lot of data on cultural assimilation of immigrants, and they do, in fact, in a generation or 2, assimilate to the home culture. So you're seeing basically people from a foreign country, but just remember, all around the world, fertility is mostly below replacement, and the only places it's not is in the poorest countries, who are on the same trajectory to get less fertility as they get rich. So, I mean, if you go to Nigeria or something, say today, you will see higher fertility, but Nigeria is pretty poor, and as they get rich, their fertility is rapidly declining. So yes, you can go, actually explore the biggest variation in the world today, but the remarkable fact is just how much convergence there is in the whole world.
Robin, from this discussion, like, and your research, what do you think is a solution to all this, like globally, let's say?
So the most obvious solution that comes to mind is, let's just talk about it and decide what our better culture is, and then adopt it consciously, because that's what we thinking people do, right? And the thing to notice in there is humanity has almost never done that.
Yeah.
We've been thinking people for hundreds of thousands of years, and we have almost never consciously planned what our culture should be and then chosen it, because these are mostly wrapped in very deep and emotional values. Obviously, if we could get enough elites to consciously talk about this and plan it, we could just say, okay, let's decide to move culture this way. But I mean, people are saying that about fertility, for example, but they're getting a lot of pushback. A lot of people say, hey, if population declines and we're all happy with it, then that should be great. Nobody should be pressuring anybody to have kids they don't want. And they would rather have the culture they like and have population fall for a long time. That's just a very common attitude.
That's a question I kind of wanted to ask there. Like, so do you think elites generally don't think that it's a big problem? Because it seems like if you or someone or people in general could convince them of this, I mean, there's all sorts of options then, right? Like you could just, I mean,
Sure.
one thing I was surprised that, you're an economist. I haven't heard the word incentives come out
No, I mean,
for having kids.
so when I was thinking about fertility, I realized there were some things we could do if we adopted those policies. They would in fact fix fertility. There are things we could do, but what I then realized, if we started to do them, what we'd see is that in the places they were fixing fertility, they were doing it by reversing some of these key cultural trends that we cherish, and that would piss people off. Like if they saw that some group of, say, so for example, say we paid a lot of money per kid, which I think is a way that work, and we pay more for better kids. There's a way to do that. Then we'd find that some groups of people were figuring out ways to get this money and have a lot more kids. And then we looked at in those people, we see how they live, and we see, well, there's a lot less gender equality there. They're going to school a lot less there. And all this, and maybe they're paying a lot less attention to the kids, and we'd be pissed and we'd be mad at them for defying our cultural norms. That's the problem, is that we really are attached to a lot of these cultural things. Most of us aren't very willing to think, no, survival matters more than these things. These things are just a proxy to figure out how to survive. No, they think, no, look, gender equality is just a value I have, and to hell with survival and civilization if it means I give up that. I'm not going to give up that.
Right. So like one
interpretation.
Yeah, I guess like one interpretation of that is that like cultural norms are a way to deal with longer term problems, and all incentives and everything else are much better for shorter term problems. You know what I mean?
Well, you need cultural support for the incentives. Like for example, look, if we just went wild and let capitalism create industrial scale orphanages and sell the kids when they were adults, that would work. We would hate that. That violates a lot of key cultural values, right? But it would work. So that doesn't work so well. So what else could work? Katherine talked about, so could we just have a lot more support and indulgence of cultural variety, i.e. cults? And if we could, that would work if we had enough. That is, say fandoms got into like actually marrying each other differently and raising kids differently and stuff like that. And we said, oh, that's so great. We love all this variety out there. That could work, but that's just going against pretty strong cultural habits. People don't like cults and they don't like them to differ, and that just bothers them. AI would solve it if I told you, although you'll have to accept then the AIs rule the world and have their own culture and live at a Malthusian world. Say again?
Like a totalitarian government, that's one.
In principle, if it were actually effective, the problem is, of course, we're not so convinced that empowering a totalitarian government because it says it's going to solve the problem would actually solve the problem. We would definitely get the totalitarian government. Whether it would fix the problem is a different matter.
I'm going to preface this with, I obviously think Mussolini was evil, but did he raise the birth rate in Italy? Does anyone know? Because I mean, he put in a lot of incentives for that.
The Nazis also actually tried to raise the birth rate, as did the Soviet Union, honestly. So there have been attempts by authoritarian regimes to raise birth rates, but overall the success. So basically, look, in the year 100, the Emperor Augustus of the Roman Empire saw they had a fertility problem, and he was definitely an authoritarian, and he laid down a lot of laws to try to push up the birth rate and basically failed. So we have examples like that in history. The solution that it fits. So look, I'm the inventor of a form of government called feutarchy. And the mechanism is basically vote on values, bet on beliefs. And so the way it would work is we'd set up an outcome that we want, and then the mechanism, betting markets would decide what to do to achieve the outcome. And there's good reasons to believe it would actually achieve whatever outcome you say. You have to be careful that what you wish for, but whatever outcome you say you want that, then you would actually get it. So if we implemented that and it works, then one solution is that we pick a long-term sacred goal that's inconsistent with civilization collapse. We couldn't just pick the goal to be preventing civilization collapse, because I don't think we could see that as sacred enough. We'd have to pick a higher goal that was grander, that would inspire us to sacrifice for it, that in fact was inconsistent with collapse, i.e. collapse would get in the way. So I did some polls asking what sort of goals could inspire people, and maybe this is because of my Twitter followers, but the 3 out of the top 4 were in space. If we say we want 1 million people living in space, or we want to get to the nearest star, then in fact, if civilization declines, that would get in the way of achieving those goals. And if we then created a futarchy, which is my form of government, put a lot of weight on let's get 1 million people living in space as soon as possible, then the speculators who run that would basically look at each policy and say, how's that going to make that happen sooner? And they would say, oh, civilization collapse can get in the way. And then they would adopt policies to try to prevent that. And then we would each notice we don't like those things and we would be bothered by them. And then we would say, oh, but this is in the service of the sacred goal. And then the interesting thing about the sacred is people are often proud to sacrifice and suffer for things that are sacred to them. And then we would say, okay, fine. Apparently, this is what we need to do to achieve this long-term sacred goal, and we will do it. And then, and the other one out of the top ones was immortality. Apparently, many people could imagine a long-term effort to produce immortality, and we were all get behind it, and that civilization collapse would probably also get in the way of that. And so then again, we would try to achieve the sacred goal through a governance mechanism that's actually effective at achieving the goal, which would then, as an incidental side effect, prevent collapse by somehow solving fertility and whatever other things are in the way. But as I said, all of the solutions we can think of aren't very attractive or seem long shots. And that's the highest level thing to say is, look, we have a problem. Nobody's been talking about it. It's a long-term problem, but it's a very serious problem that goes to the heart of who we are. We humans on the planet only are better than the other animals because of culture. And culture is this powerful engine that works better for the things that we have good metrics for than for other things. And for the other things, unfortunately, we've been making that get worse as we've been making the in culture things get better. And that's a problem I feel compelled to call people's attention to.
I personally have to go.
Thank you, Katherine.
Yeah, no problem. This turned out pretty well. Does anyone have any last minute things they want to add?
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask Robin, can you recommend some sort of canonical scholarly text on this fertility problem? Because I've only heard of it in in the blogosphere and from online people. You and the Malcolm Collins has spoken about it, but
so there have been some so I mean, for example, I just saw some academic paper linked to recently that was estimating how much we should be willing to pay to have more kids. And that I'm just searching for it here, but I think it was linked to by some of the people who are on Twitter, et cetera, talking a lot about fertility. There definitely is an academic set of publications related, but it's relatively small in the sense that most of academia isn't very concerned about it. But there definitely are publications on that. And there is a whole field of cultural evolution,
yeah,
where you can read all about how that works. Anyway, thank you all for coming.
Great. Thanks everyone. Have a great night.
Yeah, thanks all.